This is the Sony A7 III, a camera released in 2018. I bought it in 2019, and in this video I'm going to share with you 10 reasons why I think the Sony A7 III is one of the best budget full frame cameras you can buy in 2024. First of all, full frame sensor, 24 megapixels, 14 and 12-bit color depth, 14-bit in single, 12 in continuous autofocus. It's weather sealed, it's got 10 frames per second shooting, it's got a dual card slot, it's got 4K video 30 frames per second, 60 frames in HD, and more importantly you also get various different log profiles. The build quality, let's talk about that one, that's the second reason. This camera is a little bit bulky, but not too bulky. The grip is decent. Yeah, as you can see here in many of these Sony cameras, your fingers are very close to the lens. If I compare this, for instance, to Lumix cameras, this is not the case, or Canon cameras, so it's a little bit of a tight grip, but it's a good grip. I've got relatively big hands, and I never had a problem with this camera. I also like that here's kind of an automatic thumb rest built in. It's very good. The fact that it's weather sealed is great, but for the weather sealing, I never had any problems with weather sealing, because I think that the biggest enemy you have is dust and then water. But you see here with the little doors, yeah, this is kind of flimsy, but I never had any issues as such. So from my point of view, it's a pretty good build quality, and the fact that it's weather sealed is great. Also the fact, if you look at the design, nice D-pads here, yeah, so you can pretty much do whatever you want. There's a lot of customization buttons you have. Basically this camera is really aimed at anybody who wants to do either photography or videography, and it has the features to support it. So that's also a reason why I think this versatile camera is good for so many people who want to move into full frame. And yes, full frame compared to micro four thirds or APS-C still has the best image quality. And of course, the third reason is a major one. Why do you choose Sony? Well, because of the autofocus. And the Sony A7 III, this bulky beast at the moment, has 693 phase auto detection points and 425 contrast detection points. That means that if you shoot autofocus continuous, you get about 5-6 seconds for 10 frames per second, which is great. And the autofocus in 97 to 99% is in focus. So that is well done, both from a tracking point of view, yeah, on your camera when you shoot continuous, but also purely from a technology point of view. Fantastically well done. And I have to say that even Fuji on his XS20 and the X-T5 and all these cameras doesn't even come close to this 5-year-old A7 III. So in terms of autofocus, I still think Sony will always remain the best in class. Lumix has made big steps forward. Fuji with the X-T3 has as well, but even up until the X-T5, I'm not that impressed. With Sony, I am. And I shoot a lot of these episodes here nowadays on the Sony A7 III, and I have to admit, it doesn't disappoint me. I got quite a few feedback from all of you in the last 6-7 episodes that the autofocus was jilty. Well, guess again, I switched back to the Sony A7 III and it's gone. Fantastic facial tracking. It all fits. So let's go on to the next reason, is its low light capabilities, specifically for photography. I just mentioned the color depth being 14 bits in single and 12 bits in continuous. That's great, but one of the key reasons for this low light capability is its fantastic ISO handling, which goes hand in hand. Yeah, the fact that this is in-body stabilized allows you to basically shoot on 1/100th of a second. You can pretty much bunk up your ISO all the way to 12,500 or 800. I mean, I never had any problems with that. And the fact is that I can do that allows me not to shoot with a flash. Now, there's a big debate here in the photography community, flash or no flash. I would agree that flash is always a little bit better because you simply add more light. But one of the things about flashes is that I personally don't like them. I don't like it on mobile phones, don't like it on cameras. And I mean just an external flash built on top of this. Yeah, it becomes a bit different when you're in a studio environment. So for me, that's really fantastic that this camera allows me to shoot very clean images during low light with high ISOs. And nowadays with all the noise reduction tools, it almost becomes abundant, but I'd like to use as little editing tools as I possibly can, and I will probably contradict myself later in this video. Now, Sony's image quality, if I compare it to Leica or to Ricoh or to Lumix or to Fuji, I'm filming this on the Fuji X-T4 with the 18-55 onto it. One of the things that really stands out for me for Sony is their lack of color science. Leica has specific ones, Ricoh and Fuji is well known for it. Sony doesn't have it. Yes, they have their in profiles, but their colors and everything, it's all very neutral with a little shift to green at times for video. And on one hand, I love that because it allows me in post to pretty much do whatever I want to with the files, as I just said in RAW. On the other hand, the JPEGs out of camera are, in terms of color science, a little bit bland. They're neutral, they're okay. They're not necessarily reminding you of the good old days of the 70s or have the poppy thing like specific aesthetic that Leica has or those vibrantness that Ricoh can have. No, it doesn't. But that's also what the great thing about it is that you can pretty much determine afterwards what you're going to do with it. Yeah, and one of the things that I've really noticed in Sony in general is the sharpness of the pictures. Now, there's an entire debate going on, sharpness or let's say over sharpness or sharpness. There's a huge debate on it. I personally don't mind it if things aren't too sharp. Yeah, I don't like things over sharpened, otherwise I would shoot on my Google Pixel Pro. It is what it is. So sometimes, bizarrely enough, I think Sony has a bit of over sharpening, but on the other hand, you can extract fantastic colors out of it. So the image quality for me from Sony is good, but it's really designed to do a lot of post work. Yeah, so, and I personally don't mind it. You have one preset of an afternoon, you create it and you apply it to all your pictures. It's not that difficult. So let me know in the comments below, guys, what do you think of Sony's color science as such and the sharpness? Yeah. One other thing is for video, it's well known that skin tones can often tilt to the green side, and you can actually mitigate this by adjusting your white balance or doing it in post. ISO handling is great, but it also becomes because the raw files are fantastic to work with. One of the things about Sony is that I always find also on my RX100 Mark III episode here, even on my ZV-1F, raw files are great to work with. I can pretty much retrieve a lot of highlights and shadows, and you see a few examples passing by here what the original frame looked like and then the actual edited file, and it doesn't cost me much time. Now, and you can also state, and that's the next topic, another great feature for this camera, and I think that's also why it's such a good deal. It's not a photography centric camera, it's not a video centric camera, it's really a hybrid camera. And I think for those of us, I'm not much of a video shooter outside of this channel, to be very honest. And if I do, I normally do it on either my phone nowadays or on one of the DJI cameras or the Insta360 ones. But for those of you who really picked this camera up and started with photography and on a journey into videography, I think this camera has a lot to offer, specifically the video profile, so the log files, yeah, that allows you a lot of freedom in post editing. I think the IBIS here for video is decent. Who really picked this camera up and started with photography and on a journey into videography, I think this camera has a lot to offer. I think the IBIS here for video is decent. It's not best in class. It doesn't come close to what the Lumixes and the Olympus cameras are doing. It doesn't come close to an action cam, obviously, because that's digital, but it will allow you to shoot handheld if you know how to position your feet and how to use your strap as a counterbalancing. And obviously a gimbal is always a sufficient tool. Now, the eighth reason to choose this camera, and I think some of you will think, what, is the battery. Yes, these batteries here are rated for 610 to 710 shots. And if you do photography, to be very honest, I've brought them to dead metal events and all-day events. I normally, during some of the breaks, I need to just recharge it a bit, and I can easily go on a day and then I shoot about between, normally between 1,000 and 1,500 pictures. Yeah, both in continuous and non-continuous. There's one thing though, if you start shooting video, make sure you have the original Sony batteries. Do not put a third party in here, because after half an hour, suddenly, for the first time, this camera is overheating and it will shut down if you use a third party. It's a little bit of Sony sneakiness in there. But other than that, the battery life, if I compare that to all the all the batteries I have in my various different cameras, by far the best battery, and that makes a big difference if you're going out for a day, you're going hiking, you're going on holidays, whatever you use this camera for. Battery life is a big selling point. Now with number 9 we get a bigger selling point. If you like the video up until now, please hit that like button, consider subscribing and follow me on www.paultakesphotos.com. One of the biggest things for any new camera that you basically buy is to look at the lens ecosystem, and Sony has two mounts on the modern cameras. It's the E mount for the APS-C, so the A6000 series, and the FE for the full frames. Now the great thing about Sony is not only they've got an incredible Sony lens selection, which is really roundly ridiculous. One of my favorite lenses is the 85mm f1.8, fantastic lens, very cheap, but also the number of third parties, Sigma, Tamron, Laowa, you name them, they're all in it. So you've got a choice out of a ridiculous range of lenses with a fantastic pricing range as well. You can go for the GM, costing you a fortune, or you can just go for a normal lens, not costing you a fortune. I think it's a big selling point as well. All of these lenses are a little bit bulky, but that's also great that you've got this little body where they all fit on. This, by the way, is the Samyang 24mm f1.9 autofocus cinema lens, which I normally use for this channel, right? So that's already great. Now all of that combined, last but not least, the price, and that's where things get really interesting. If you look at camera prices from the latest release cameras, when this came out, I think it was 2,500 bucks. If you saw the Sony A7III, so its successor, I think it was priced when it came out at around 3,000 bucks. This camera now new is about 1,200 to 1,300 bucks here in Europe and America. It's a bit cheaper. But on the actual used market, you can get a good deal from somewhere between 750 and 900 bucks. Now, some of you will say, hold on, but you do have the Lumix S5. You can get that for the same price. And I agree. And that is a great camera, but it doesn't have the autofocus like a Sony. If you look at the prices of the latest Sony cameras, the ZV-10II, I always get confused by these cameras, but they tend to be fairly priced. But I really think that this is not only a classic, but you get so much for a very fair price. And if you pair this with the right lenses, you're going to enjoy yourself tremendously. And if you look for a smaller form factor, yeah, you might want to consider the Sony A7C